The stagecoach lurched violently as its wheels caught another rut in the dusty Colorado Trail, sending Catherine Hayes tumbling against the worn leather seat. She clutched her carpetbag tighter, protecting the small bundle of letters that represented her only hope for a future beyond the suffocating confines of Boston's charity ward. At 26, Catherine had already buried a husband, lost a child to fever, and watched her modest inheritance disappear into medical bills and funeral expenses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The advertisement had appeared in the Boston Herald on a Tuesday morning in March, simple words that had ignited something she'd thought permanently extinguished. Established lawman in growing Colorado territory seeks respectable wife. Steady income, safe community, ready-made home awaits the right woman. Write to Marshal Thomas Garrett, Silver Creek, Colorado. What had drawn her wasn't just the promise of security, though heaven knew she needed that desperately. It was the phrase, ready-made home, that had captured her imagination during those long nights in the boarding house room she could barely afford. After 18 months of grief and struggle, the possibility of belonging somewhere again, of having a place where she wasn't merely tolerated but actually wanted, had proven irresistible. Thomas Garrett's letters had painted a picture of Silver Creek that seemed almost too good to be true, a prosperous mining town nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, where silver strikes had brought steady growth and civilization to the Colorado wilderness. He'd described neat rows of houses, a school, 2 churches and businesses that served not just the miners, but the ranchers and farmers who'd followed the mining boom. I built my house with the hope of filling it someday with a family, he'd written in his careful masculine script. The town is safe, law-abiding, and full of good people who'd welcome a refined lady from the East. I may not be a romantic man, Miss Hayes, but I'm steady, honest, and looking for a partnership that could grow into something deeper with time. Catherine had read those letters so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. She'd written back about her background as a minister's daughter, her brief marriage to Robert Hayes, a clerk who died in a factory accident after only 2 years together, and her struggle to survive alone in a city that offered few opportunities for respectable women without connections or capital. She hadn't mentioned little Mary, the daughter who'd lived only 6 months before succumbing to the same fever that had taken so many children that terrible winter. Some wounds were too deep to expose to a stranger, even one offering marriage and a new life. The correspondence had continued for 3 months, each exchange revealing more about their compatibility. Thomas wrote about his work maintaining order in a frontier town, his small but comfortable house on Elm Street, his hope that Silver Creek would continue growing as Colorado moved toward statehood. Catherine shared her love of reading, her skill with needlework and cooking, her dream of teaching children if the opportunity arose. When he'd finally proposed marriage in his 10th letter, including funds for passage west, Catherine had accepted without hesitation. What did she have to lose? Her current life consisted of taking in mending for barely enough to pay rent on a single room, eating 1 meal a day, and watching other women her age raise families while she remained invisible and increasingly desperate. The journey from Boston had taken 2 weeks by train, then another week by stagecoach through increasingly wild country. Catherine had never traveled farther than the Boston suburbs, and each mile westward had revealed landscapes she'd only imagined from books. Rolling farmland gave way to vast prairies, then to the foothills of mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. Her fellow passengers on this final leg of the journey were a mix of prospectors, traveling salesmen, and other hopefuls seeking their fortunes in Colorado's mining camps. Catherine had kept to herself, clutching her small Bible and trying to appear confident, despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. What if Thomas Garrett wasn't the man his letters suggested? What if Silver Creek wasn't the thriving community he'd described? What if she'd made a terrible mistake in traveling so far to marry a complete stranger? But even these fears seemed preferable to returning to Boston with nothing. At least in Colorado, she'd have a chance at a different life, whatever that might bring. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Jake Morrison, had been making this route for 5 years. He'd reassured Catherine that Silver Creek was indeed a fine town, though he'd seemed oddly quiet about recent conditions there. When she'd pressed him about Thomas Garrett, Jake had simply nodded and said the Marshal was a good man before, changing the subject. Now, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, Jake called down from his perch that they were approaching Silver Creek. Catherine smoothed her traveling dress, a deep blue wool that had been her best before. Her circumstances had reduced her wardrobe to a few serviceable pieces. She'd saved her nicest remaining dress for the wedding, a grey silk that had been her second best before widowhood made bright colours seem inappropriate. The stagecoach crested a low hill, and Catherine pressed her face to the window, eager for her first glimpse of her new home. What she saw made her heart stop. Below them lay not the thriving town Thomas Garrett had described, but a scene of utter devastation. Blackened timbers stood like skeletal fingers against the sky where buildings had once been. Rubble and ash covered what had been streets. Not a single structure remained intact, save for the charred stone foundation of what might have been a church. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in what had once been the town centre. Catherine climbed down on unsteady legs, her carpet-bag heavy in her hands as she stared at the destruction surrounding her. The air still carried the acrid smell of smoke, though the fires had clearly been out for some time. "Dear God," she whispered, turning in a slow circle to take in the full extent of the devastation. "What happened here?" Jake Morrison climbed down from the driver's seat, his face grim. "Comanche raiders hit the town about 6 weeks ago, miss. Came in at dawn when most folks were still sleeping. Burned everything they couldn't carry off." Catherine's knees went weak. "The people? What happened to the people?" "Some got away into the mountains. Others." Jake shook his head. "It was bad, miss. Real bad. Most of the survivors headed back east or down to Denver. Town's been empty since." The reality of her situation crashed over her like a physical blow. She was stranded in the ruins of a destroyed town, 1,000 miles from Boston, with less than $5 to her name and nowhere to go. The man she'd come to marry might be dead. The home he'd promised her existed only as ash and memory. "There's got to be someone left," she said desperately, looking around for any sign of life. "The Marshal, Thomas Garrett, he must have survived. He was supposed to meet me here." Jake's expression softened with pity. "Miss, I don't know how to tell you this gentle-like, but Marshal Garrett, he's right here." The voice came from behind, a pile of rubble that had once been the mercantile. Catherine spun around to see a man emerging from what looked like a makeshift camp among the ruins. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and a face weathered by sun and hardship. His clothes were rough and patched, nothing like the respectable attire she'd expected from a town marshal, but his eyes, deep brown and filled with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep, matched the thoughtful gaze she'd imagined while reading his letters. "Thomas?" she asked uncertainly. He nodded slowly, approaching with careful steps, as if he wasn't entirely sure she was real. "You're Catherine Hayes. You came anyway." The statement held a mixture of wonder and disbelief that made her throat tighten with emotion. "Your letters said to come in June." "It's June." Thomas stopped a few feet away, studying her face as if memorizing her features. "I wrote to you 3 weeks ago after the raid, told you not to come. Told you there was nothing left here for you, or anyone else." Catherine's heart sank. "I never received that letter. I was already traveling when you must have sent it." They stood in silence for a moment, the magnitude of the situation settling between them. Catherine had travelled across the continent to marry a man and start a new life in a town that no longer existed. Thomas had tried to spare her this devastation, but had failed to reach her in time. "The others?" she asked quietly. "Jake said some people escaped." Thomas's jaw tightened. 43 people lived in Silver Creek when the raiders came. 16 got away into the mountains. I've accounted for 11 bodies. The rest—" He gestured helplessly at the ruins around them. "Some were taken, some burned, some we'll never find." Catherine absorbed this information with the strange calm that comes with shock too great for immediate emotional response. 43 people, a small town, but a community nonetheless. Families, children, hopes and dreams, all reduced to ashes and memory. "Why are you still here?" she asked. Thomas looked surprised by the question. "Where else would I go? This is my town. These were my people. I was supposed to protect them." The pain in his voice was so raw that Catherine instinctively stepped closer. She could see now that the man before her was nothing like the confident lawman who'd written those letters. This was someone hollowed out by grief and responsibility, haunted by a failure that had cost him everything he'd sworn to defend. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "Wasn't it?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "I was the Marshal. I was supposed to know when danger was coming. I was supposed to keep people safe. Instead, I was asleep in my bed when they hit us. By the time I got organized, half the town was already burning." Jake Morrison cleared his throat. "Miss Hayes, I hate to interrupt, but I need to know what you want to do. I can take you back to Denver if you want. Stage leaves tomorrow morning from Copper Falls, about 10 miles south of here." Catherine looked from Jake to Thomas, to the ruins surrounding them. Every rational instinct told her to climb back into that stagecoach and return to whatever life she could scrape together in civilization. She had no money, no prospects, and no future in this devastated place. But looking at Thomas Garrett, seeing the depth of his pain and his determination to remain in this graveyard of his former life, she felt something stir in her chest that had been dormant since her own losses in Boston. Recognition, perhaps, the understanding that comes from shared devastation. "I'll stay," she said quietly. Both men stared at her in shock. Jake was the first to recover. "Miss, you can't be serious. There's nothing here. No shelter, no supplies, no other people. You'll die out here." "There's him," Catherine said, nodding toward Thomas. "And I've already died once. I don't think I can do it again." Thomas stepped forward, his expression intense. "Catherine, you don't understand what you're saying. I'm living in a tent made from salvaged canvas. I'm eating whatever I can hunt or find growing wild. There's no house, no safety, no future here. Everything I promised you in those letters is gone." "Then we'll build something new," Catherine replied with more conviction than she felt. "You said in your letters that you were looking for a partnership. That doesn't require a house or a thriving town. It just requires 2 people willing to try." She set down her carpetbag and looked around at the ruins with fresh eyes. This valley is still beautiful. The mountains are still here. The land is still good. If people built a town here once, they can do it again. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, searching for something. "You have no idea what you're agreeing to. The raiders could come back. Winter in these mountains is harsh. We don't have proper shelter or supplies for 2 people, let alone whatever it would take to rebuild." "I know," Catherine said simply, "but I also know I have nowhere else to go, and you're the only person who's offered me a chance at something better than survival. If that chance is here in the ruins of Silver Creek, then that's where I need to be." Jake Morrison shook his head, but began unloading Catherine's trunk from the stagecoach. "I think you're both crazy. But it's your choice, miss. I'll tell folks in Denver where you are, case anyone comes looking." As the stagecoach rolled away toward the mountains, leaving Catherine and Thomas alone among the ruins, she realized the full weight of what she'd committed to. She'd come west, expecting to step into a ready-made life, to become part of an established community where she could heal from her losses and build toward a secure future. Instead, she'd found a man as broken as herself, in a place that existed only in memory and ash. The safe, comfortable life Thomas Garrett had promised was gone, replaced by uncertainty, danger, and the daunting prospect of starting over from absolutely nothing. But as she watched Thomas pick up her trunk with careful courtesy, as she saw the way his shoulders straightened slightly at her decision to stay, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. For the first time since losing her daughter, she was needed not for what she could provide or the work she could do, but simply for being willing to stand beside someone else. In their darkest hour, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the ruins of Silver Creek in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Catherine Hayes wasn't alone. The first night in the ruins of Silver Creek tested every ounce of determination Catherine had summoned. Thomas led her to his makeshift camp behind what had been the bank, where he'd constructed a lean-to shelter from salvaged timber and canvas. The structure looked barely adequate for one person, let alone two. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You can have the shelter," Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral as he gestured toward the canvas covering. "I've been sleeping under the stars anyway. Helps me keep watch for movement on the ridges." Catherine examined the cramped space, noting the single bedroll, a few tin plates, and a small collection of supplies that represented Thomas's entire remaining possessions. Everything he'd built over years of establishing himself in Silver Creek had been reduced to what he could carry in 2 saddlebags. The reality of what she'd committed to was beginning to sink in with uncomfortable clarity. In Boston, even in her poorest moments, she'd had walls around her, a roof over her head, the basic infrastructure of civilization. Here, she was looking at canvas stretched over broken timber as her only protection against the Colorado wilderness. "We can share the space," she said practically, trying to keep doubt from creeping into her voice. "There's room if we're civilized about it, and you need proper rest if you're going to help me figure out how to survive here." Thomas's expression shifted, revealing a flicker of something that might have been surprise or gratitude before his careful mask reasserted itself. "Catherine, I need you to understand something. When I wrote those letters, when I made those promises about a home and a future, I meant every word. But that man, that life, it's gone. What's left isn't what you agreed to marry." She studied his face in the gathering twilight, noting the hollow cheeks that spoke of inadequate meals, the lines of constant vigilance around his eyes, the way his hand never strayed far from the gun at his hip. This wasn't the confident lawman whose letters had won her heart across 1,000 miles of distance. This was a man haunted by ghosts, surviving on determination alone. "What exactly are you telling me, Thomas?" He turned away, staring out at the blackened remains of what had been Main Street. In the moonlight, the skeletal ruins cast strange shadows that seemed to move and shift, creating the illusion of phantom buildings populated by phantom people. "I'm telling you that I can't be your husband. Not like this. Not when I can barely keep myself alive, let alone protect anyone else. You should take the next stage out of here. Go to Denver, find work, find a man who can give you what you deserve." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. After traveling across the continent, after finding the courage to commit her future to a stranger, after declaring her willingness to rebuild from nothing, he was rejecting her just as surely as if he'd met her at the station and turned away. But this rejection carried a different quality than the casual dismissal she'd faced from potential employers in Boston, or the polite disinterest of men who'd considered her too damaged by widowhood to be worth pursuing. This was a man pushing her away, not from lack of feeling, but from too much of it, specifically the crushing weight of guilt and responsibility that was slowly destroying him. "I see." She kept her voice level, despite the crushing weight settling in her chest. "So your letters were just fantasies, stories you told yourself about a life you never really intended to live?" "They weren't fantasies," Thomas said sharply, finally turning to face her. "Every word was true when I wrote it. I had a house, a town to protect, a future worth sharing. Now I have nothing but guilt and the need for revenge that's eating me. Alive from the inside. Revenge." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Thomas's jaw tightened. "The raiders who did this, they're not finished. They hit 3 other settlements in the past 2 months. Always the same pattern, always moving north toward the main mining camps. I'm going to find them, and I'm going to make them pay for what they did here." The revelation transformed Catherine's understanding of why Thomas remained in the ruins. This wasn't about grief or duty to the dead. This was about a man consumed by the need for vengeance, camping in a graveyard while he planned to hunt down the killers of his town. She looked around at the destruction with new eyes, seeing it now not as the site of a future rebuilding project, but as a war memorial, a shrine to violence that demanded more violence in return. Thomas wasn't staying here to heal or rebuild. He was staying here to feed his anger, to keep his rage sharp and focused. "That's why you're still here," she said quietly, "not to rebuild or honor the dead, but to use this place as a base for hunting raiders. Does it matter why?" Thomas's voice carried an edge of defensive anger. "The result is the same. This isn't a place for a woman, Catherine. It's not a place for anyone who wants to live instead of just survive." Catherine felt the last of her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. She'd risked everything on the promise of a new life, only to find herself in a nightmare of destruction with a man more interested in revenge than rebuilding. The future she'd imagined, the partnership Thomas had described in his letters, had been as thoroughly destroyed as the buildings around them. "So what am I supposed to do?" she asked, hating the way her voice shook. "I spent my last money getting here. I have nowhere to go, no family to take me in, no prospects for employment in the middle of nowhere." "You promised me a life, Thomas." "Garrett, and now you're telling me that promise died with your town." Thomas's expression softened at her obvious distress, but his voice remained firm. "I'll give you money for passage to Denver. There are opportunities there for a woman with your education and background. You can start over properly, not like this." "With what money?" Catherine laughed bitterly, gesturing at their surroundings. "Look around you. What do you have left to give anyone? And even if you could afford my passage, what makes you think I want to start over again? I've already done that twice, after my husband died, after my daughter died. I'm tired of starting over, Thomas. I came here because your letters promised an end to that." The mention of her daughter slipped out before Catherine could stop it, and she saw Thomas's expression shift as he registered this new information about her losses. But she was too exhausted and frustrated to care about maintaining the careful editing of her past that had characterized their correspondence. "You had a child," Thomas said softly. "Mary. She lived 6 months." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold as the mountain air carried the scent of ash and death through the ruins. "Fever took her the same winter that took half the children in our neighborhood. I buried her in Boston, in a plot I couldn't afford to maintain, and I couldn't bear to stay in a city full of her ghost." The words came pouring out now, all the carefully guarded pain she'd kept locked away during their months of correspondence. "Do you know what it's like to lose a child, Thomas? To feel like every breath you take is stolen from someone who deserved life more than you do? I spent 18 months in Boston trying to find a reason to keep living, and your letters gave me that reason. They made me believe I could build something new, something meaningful, instead of just existing until I died." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. "I'm sorry, I know what it's like to lose people you're supposed to protect." "Do you?" Catherine's grief was transforming into anger, giving her strength. "Because it seems to me like you're more interested in avenging your losses than living with them. At least when my daughter died, I didn't decide the world owed me blood payment." The words hung between them in the growing darkness, harsh and unforgiving. Thomas's face went rigid, and Catherine immediately regretted the cruel comparison. But she was too hurt and frightened to apologize. "You don't know what happened here," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You don't know what I saw, what I failed to prevent. Don't presume to judge choices you haven't had to make." "Then tell me," Catherine challenged, her own anger flaring to match his. "Stop talking around it and tell me exactly what happened." "To Silver Creek. Make me understand why revenge is more important than building something new." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. She could see the war playing out across his features, the desire to protect her from the full horror of what he'd witnessed battling against his need. To make her understand why he couldn't be the man she'd traveled so far to marry. Finally, he seemed to have come to some internal decision. He settled onto a piece of rubble that had once been part of the mercantile's front steps, his movements careful and controlled. "I'd been a marshal here for 3 years, he began, his voice distant. "Good years, mostly. Silver Creek was growing, prospering. We had families settling down, children being born, people making long-term plans. I thought I'd found my place, my purpose." Catherine remained standing, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but she listened intently as Thomas's story unfolded. The raids started small, distant, hitting isolated homesteads and mining claims 50, 60 miles away, always at dawn, always moving fast, taking what they could carry and burning the rest. I organized patrols, sent warnings to the territorial. Authorities tried to coordinate with other towns, but the attacks were scattered, random. There was no pattern I could see. Thomas picked up a piece of charred wood, turning it over in his hands, as if the blackened timber could somehow explain the inexplicable. The territorial marshal told me these were probably just isolated incidents. Different groups of bandits, maybe some rogue Comanche. Nothing organized enough to threaten an established town like Silver Creek. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Catherine began to understand the weight of guilt Thomas carried, the way it had twisted his sense of responsibility into something that was destroying him from within. The attacks got closer over the winter. The Patterson place, then the Mackenzie Ranch, then the mining camp at Willow Creek, each one a little closer to Silver Creek, each one a little more vicious than the last. I started keeping men on watch, organized the townspeople into shifts, but it still felt distant, like something that happened to other people in other places. His voice was growing quieter, more distant, as if he were watching the events unfold again in his memory. The night before they hit us, I'd gotten word that the Morrison family's ranch had been attacked. 20 miles south of here, good people, who'd been neighbors to Silver Creek since the beginning. I took my 2 best men and rode out to help with the aftermath. Catherine could see where this was leading, and she felt her anger beginning to ebb in the face of Thomas's obvious anguish. We found the ranch house burned to the ground, but the Morrisons had gotten away. They'd seen the raiders coming and managed to get their children to safety in the mountains. But their livestock was gone, their winter supplies destroyed. They needed help securing what was left, needed someone to help them bury their horses and salvage what they could. Thomas's hands tightened on the piece of wood until his knuckles went white. We stayed overnight to help them, figuring the work would go faster with daylight. It was the right thing to do, the neighborly thing. But it meant I wasn't in Silver Creek when the attack came. You couldn't have known, Catherine began, but Thomas cut her off with a sharp gesture. Couldn't I? 3 months of attacks moving steadily in our direction, and I chose that night to be somewhere else. We saw the smoke from 15 miles away, Catherine. Columns of black smoke rising into the morning sky like funeral pyres. By the time we got back, it was too late for everything except counting the dead. Catherine sank down onto another piece of rubble, the full horror of what Thomas had experienced beginning to penetrate her own grief and disappointment. The attack had come at first light, just like all the others, Thomas continued, his voice now barely audible. But this time they hadn't just raided and moved on. They'd been methodical, systematic. Every building was searched before it was burned, every hiding place violated. Every person who couldn't run fast enough was either killed or taken. He stood abruptly, walking to the edge of their small camp where he could look out over the ruins. I found Mrs. Henderson first. She'd taught school here for 20 years, never hurt a soul in her life. The children loved her, called her grandmother. Henderson, even when they grew up and had children of their own, they'd left her in the ruins of the schoolhouse, and from the way they'd positioned her, he stopped, shaking his head. She'd tried to protect the children who were hiding there. 3 of them all under 10 years old. Catherine felt tears starting in her eyes as the full scope of the tragedy began to register. These weren't just statistics or abstract victims. These were people Thomas had known intimately, had sworn to protect, had cared about as individuals. Then I found the Kowalski family barricaded in their root cellar. Jan was a blacksmith, strong as an ox, fought in the war. His wife Maria made the best bread in 3 territories. They had 4 children, ages 6 to 16. They'd tried to hide when the attack started, but the raiders had found them anyway. Thomas's voice cracked. The cellar door had been pried open from the outside. He turned back to face Catherine, and she could see tears reflecting the moonlight on his cheeks. 16 people made it to the mountains, mostly women and children who ran when the shooting started, hiding in caves until it was safe to come back. They told me what they'd seen, how the raiders had moved through the town, like they knew exactly where to look, like they'd planned every detail. Catherine felt the weight of survivor's guilt settling over her shoulders like a physical presence. She was beginning to understand not just what had happened to Silver Creek, but what it had done to Thomas's sense of identity and purpose. 43 people called Silver Creek home, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. 43 human beings with dreams and fears and people who loved them. I was supposed to keep them safe, and I failed every single one of them. I wasn't here when they needed me most, and now they're dead because I made the wrong choice. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of different kinds of loss. Catherine realized that Thomas's rejection hadn't been about not wanting her, but about his belief that he was fundamentally broken, incapable of protecting anyone else he might come to care about. "So you're staying here to hunt down the raiders," she said finally. "I'm staying here because I can't live with myself if I don't try to get justice for what happened. The territorial authorities are spread too thin, and they're focused on protecting the bigger settlements. 3 other towns have been hit since Silver Creek, and the pattern's getting clearer. Someone has to track these killers down before they hit another family, another community." Thomas pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket, spreading it out on a flat piece of rubble. In the moonlight, Catherine could see it was a hand-drawn map, marked with X's and dates. "I've been tracking their movements, trying to find the pattern," he explained. "They hit isolated targets first, learning the territory, then move on to bigger prizes. Silver Creek was just practice for whatever they're really after. The mining camps up north are still vulnerable, still unprotected." Catherine studied the map, noting the methodical progression of attacks moving steadily northward through the Colorado territory. You think they're planning something bigger? I know they are. The question is whether I can find them before they find their next target. Thomas refolded the map carefully. And that's why I can't honor the promises I made. In those letters, Catherine, this isn't about building a life anymore. This is about preventing more deaths, about making sure what happened here doesn't happen somewhere else. Catherine absorbed this, understanding now why Thomas felt he couldn't move forward into any kind of normal future. In his mind, he was already dead, a ghost haunting the ruins of his failure, committed to a mission that would likely get him killed. "And you think I should just walk away from all this?" she said. "Find some safe little life in Denver and pretend I never came here, never met you, never heard about Silver Creek?" "I think you should find a life that has a future in it," Thomas replied firmly. "Not this. This isn't living, Catherine. This is just existing until I can find the bastards who did this and make them pay. You deserve better than that. You deserve the life I promised you in those letters, even if I can't be the one to give it to you." Catherine stood up, brushing ash and debris from her traveling dress. The practical side of her mind catalogued the impossibility of her situation with brutal clarity. No money, no shelter, no prospects, stranded in the ruins of a town with a man obsessed with revenge who'd made it clear he wanted her gone. Every rational consideration pointed toward accepting Thomas's rejection and finding some way to get to Denver. But as she looked around at the moonlit ruins of Silver Creek, she felt something besides despair stirring in her chest. These buildings, these streets represented more than just destruction. They represented dreams that had been violently interrupted, plans that had been cut short, a community that had been murdered in its sleep. "What if I don't want a safe little life in Denver?" she asked quietly. Thomas looked up at her sharply, confusion evident in his expression. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I'm tired of running away from difficult things? What if I want to stay here and help you rebuild what was lost, not just hunt down who destroyed it?" "Catherine, you're not thinking clearly. This place is cursed. Everyone who tried to make a life here is dead or gone. There's nothing left to rebuild from, nothing left to build toward." "There's you," she said simply. "And now there's me. That's more than nothing. That's the beginning of everything if we let it be." Thomas stood abruptly, his frustration evident in every line of his body. "You don't understand. I'm not the man who wrote you those letters. That man believed in the future, in building something lasting, in protecting the people he cared about. I don't believe in anything anymore except making sure the people who did this pay for it." "Then maybe it's time you remembered what you used to believe in," Catherine replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Because the man who wrote me those letters, he was someone worth traveling across the country to marry, and I don't think he's as dead as you want everyone to believe." Thomas turned away from her, staring out at the dark mountains where the raiders had disappeared after their attack. "That man got 43 people killed because he thought he could protect them. I won't make that mistake again. So instead, you'll make the mistake of throwing away everything good that might still be possible." Catherine moved closer to him, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands shook slightly with suppressed emotion. "Thomas, I understand guilt. I understand feeling responsible for losses you couldn't prevent, but I also understand that guilt can become another kind of death if you let it." "This isn't about guilt," Thomas said harshly. "This is about justice. This is about making sure what happened here never happens again." "And what happens after you get your justice?" Catherine pressed. "What happens after you track down every raider, settle every score? Do you think the people who died here would want you to spend the rest of your life as a ghost haunting their memory?" Thomas spun to face her, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made her take a step backward. "Don't you dare tell me what the dead would want." You didn't know them. You didn't fail them. You didn't have to bury children and grandmothers and fathers who trusted you to keep them safe. You're right, Catherine said quietly. I didn't know them. But I know you, or at least I know the man who wrote me letters full of hope and plans for the future. That man wouldn't want to spend his life consumed by hatred, no matter what he'd lost. That man was a fool, Thomas said bitterly. That man believed in things that don't exist: safety, security, the possibility of protecting the people you love from the ugliness of the world. Catherine felt tears starting in her eyes, not for herself, but for the man standing before her, so consumed by his failures that he couldn't see any possibility beyond revenge. Thomas, what if I told you I don't need you to protect me? What if I told you I came here not looking for safety, but for partnership, for someone to stand beside, not behind? Then I'd tell you that you're as much a fool as I was, Thomas replied. This world doesn't care about partnerships or plans or people who think they can build something better. This world burns down everything you try to create and leaves you standing in the ashes. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, the distant whinny of a horse coming from somewhere in the ruins behind them. Thomas's hand went immediately to his gun as he motioned for Catherine to stay quiet. They waited in tense silence, listening for any other sounds that might indicate they weren't alone in the ruins. After several minutes, Thomas relaxed slightly, but his hand remained near his weapon. Probably just a wild horse, he said quietly. Sometimes they wander down from the mountains looking for water, but Catherine had seen the way his entire body had gone rigid at the first sound, the way his eyes had immediately begun scanning the shadows for threats. This was what Thomas's life had become: constant vigilance, constant readiness for attack, constant expectation that violence would find him no matter where he tried to hide. This is how you live, she said, understanding flooding through her. Always waiting for the next attack, always ready to fight or run. No wonder you don't want to rebuild anything. How can you plan for the future when you're always expecting it to be destroyed? Thomas looked at her with something that might have been surprise. Now you're beginning to understand. I understand that you're trapped, Catherine said. Trapped by what happened here, trapped by your need for revenge, trapped by your fear that caring about anything will just give the world something else to take away from you. I'm not trapped, Thomas protested. I'm focused. I have a purpose, a mission. You have a prison, Catherine interrupted, a prison made of guilt and anger, and the belief that the only way to honor the dead is to become dead yourself inside, if not outside. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Catherine could see the conflict playing out across his features. Part of him wanted to argue, to defend his chosen path of vengeance. But another part, the part that had written those hopeful letters, the part that had dreamed of a future worth sharing, was listening to her words and recognizing their truth. Even if you're right, he said finally, it doesn't change anything. The people who did this are still out there. More towns are still at risk. I can't just ignore that and pretend we can build some kind of normal life in the middle of all this destruction. I'm not asking you to ignore it, Catherine replied. I'm asking you to consider that there might be more than one way to honor the dead. Maybe instead of hunting their killers, we could rebuild what they lost. Maybe instead of adding more violence to the world, we could add something beautiful. Beautiful. Thomas laughed bitterly, gesturing at the ruins around them. Look around you, Catherine. What could possibly be beautiful about this? Catherine was quiet for a moment, studying the moonlit landscape of destruction. Then she began to speak, her voice soft, but growing stronger with conviction. I see the place where Mrs. Henderson taught children to read, and I think about all the minds she opened, all the futures she made possible. I see where the Kowalski family lived and worked, and I think about the things Jan built that made life easier for his neighbors, the bread Maria shared that brought people together. She turned to face Thomas directly. "I see a place where 43 people chose to build their lives because they believed in something better than what they'd left behind. And I think the most beautiful thing we could do for their memory would be to prove that their faith in the future wasn't misplaced." Thomas was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "You make it sound so simple." "Not simple," Catherine corrected. "Necessary. Thomas, I've spent the last 18 months learning the difference between existing and living. After Mary died, I existed. I went through the motions, survived from day to day, but I wasn't really alive. It wasn't until I read your letters, until I started imagining a different future, that I remembered what it felt like to be truly alive." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the tears he was trying to hide. "You're doing the same thing. Now that I did then, you're existing, surviving, going through the motions of having a purpose, but you're not living. And the people who died here, they were living. They were building and hoping and planning for tomorrow. Don't you think they'd want you to do the same?" Thomas turned away from her, but Catherine could see his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "I don't know how," he said finally. "I don't know how to stop seeing their faces every time I close my eyes. I don't know how to stop feeling responsible for every moment of pain they suffered." "You learn," Catherine said gently. "The same way I learned to live with losing Mary. The same way everyone learns to carry loss without being crushed by it. You take it one day at a time, and you let people who care about you help carry the weight." "And you think you could do that?" Thomas asked, turning back to face her. "You think you could stay here, in this place where so many people died, and help me figure out how to live again?" Catherine looked around at the ruins one more time, seeing them now not as symbols of destruction, but as the foundation for whatever might come next. "I think," she said carefully, "that two broken people might be able to help each other heal. I think that might be why I came here, even if neither of us understood it at the time." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see the war playing out across his features, hope battling against despair, the desire for connection, fighting against the fear of loss. Finally, he spoke. "If you stay, Catherine, I can't. Promise you'll be safe. The raiders could come back. Winter in these mountains is brutal, and I—" He hesitated, then continued with painful honesty. "I don't know if I remember how to care about someone without failing them." "I'm not asking for promises," Catherine replied. "I'm asking for a chance to find out what two people can build together when they stop running from their losses and start building toward their hopes." Thomas studied her face in the moonlight, searching for something. "You're serious about this? You actually want to stay here in the ruins of Silver Creek and try to build something new?" "I want to stay here with you," Catherine corrected. "The place doesn't matter as much as the person. And I think the person you are, not the person you were before all this happened, but the person you are now, with all your scars and guilt and determination, I think that person is worth staying for." Thomas reached out slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real, and touched her face gently. "Catherine Hayes," he said softly, "I think you might be the bravest person I've ever met." Before Catherine could respond, they were interrupted by a sound that made Thomas's hand snap back to his gun, the unmistakable sound of horse hooves moving fast, approaching from the south. But this time it wasn't just one horse. In the moonlight, Catherine could make out shapes on the ridge overlooking the town, riders, at least a dozen of them, moving with the confident purpose of men who owned the night. Thomas pushed Catherine behind the remains of a stone wall, his voice urgent and low. "Stay down and don't make a sound. No matter what happens, don't try to help me. Just stay hidden." As Catherine crouched in the rubble of Silver Creek, listening to the approaching riders and feeling Thomas's tension radiating through the darkness, she realized that her choice about staying or leaving might be about to be made for her. The raiders had returned, and this time there would be nowhere to run. The riders on the ridge turned out to be a false alarm, a patrol from Fort Collins searching for the same raiders that haunted Thomas's dreams. Captain Samuel Morrison, a weathered cavalry officer with graying temples and tired eyes, dismounted near their camp as dawn broke over the Colorado mountains. "Marshal Garrett," Morrison said, extending his hand in greeting. "We've been looking for you. Got word you were still here in Silver Creek, though nobody could figure out why." Thomas accepted the handshake, but remained wary. "Captain Morrison, what brings the cavalry this far south?" "Same thing that's keeping you awake at night, I'd wager." Morrison gestured toward the ruins surrounding them. "The raiders hit another settlement 2 days ago. Copper Ridge, about 40 miles northeast of here. Similar pattern, dawn attack, buildings burned, people killed or taken." Catherine emerged from behind the stone wall where she'd spent the night huddled against the cold, her traveling dress wrinkled and stained with ash. Morrison's eyebrows rose at the sight of her, clearly not expecting to find a woman in the ruins of Silver Creek. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully, "I'm Captain Morrison, Fort Collins Garrison. I didn't realize Marshal Garrett had done company." "Catherine Hayes," she replied, lifting her chin with dignity despite her disheveled appearance. "I arrived yesterday from Boston." Morrison's expression shifted to one of concern, mixed with confusion. "Boston? With all due respect, this isn't exactly a tourist country right now. The entire territory between here and the Wyoming border is considered hostile." "Miss Hayes is—" Thomas began, then stopped, clearly unsure how to explain their situation. "I'm his intended wife," Catherine said simply, surprised by how natural the words felt, despite everything that had transpired between them the night before. Or was, before circumstances changed. Captain Morrison looked between them, taking in Thomas's haggard appearance and Catherine's determined expression. "I see. Well, ma'am, I'm afraid the circumstances have changed considerably since you began your journey. This entire region is under military advisory. We're recommending all civilians evacuate to Denver or Colorado Springs until we can neutralize the raider threat." "How many men do you have for this neutralization effort?" Thomas asked. "2 companies, about 80 men total, but we're spread thin, trying to protect 7 different settlements across a territory the size of Massachusetts." Morrison's frustration was evident. "Every time we get close to the raiders, they disappear into the mountains like smoke. They know this country better than we do." Thomas pulled out his hand-drawn map, spreading it on a flat piece of rubble. "I've been tracking their movements for 6 weeks. Look at this pattern." Morrison studied the map intently, his trained eye, immediately recognizing what Thomas had discovered. "They're moving systematically northward, hitting targets of increasing value, testing defenses, learning the territory." "Exactly, and I think I know where they're headed next." Thomas pointed to a spot on the map marked with a star. "Silverton. It's the biggest mining camp in the territory, sitting on more silver than all the other settlements combined. If they can take Silverton, they'd have enough wealth to buy weapons, horses and men to hit targets all the way to Denver," Morrison finished grimly. "How certain are you about this assessment?" "Certain enough to stake my life on it," Thomas replied. "The question is whether we can get there first." Catherine listened to this exchange with growing understanding. Thomas's obsession with tracking the raiders wasn't just about revenge. It was about preventing another massacre like the one that had destroyed Silver Creek. But the military approach, spreading forces thin across multiple targets, was exactly the wrong strategy for dealing with an enemy that struck fast and disappeared faster. "Captain Morrison," she said, interrupting the 2 men's tactical discussion. "What if there was another approach?" Both men turned to look at her with expressions of polite skepticism. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but pressed on. You're trying to protect every possible target, which means you can't adequately protect any of them. The raiders succeed because they choose when and where to attack. But what if you could choose the battlefield instead? Morrison's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. What exactly are you suggesting, ma'am? Catherine moved closer to the map, pointing to Silver Creek's location. This town is perfectly positioned to control access to the northern mining camps. The main trail runs right through this valley. What if, instead of trying to guard every settlement, you made this the place where the raiders had to come to you? You're talking about using Silver Creek as bait, Thomas said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. I'm talking about using Silver Creek as a fortress, Catherine corrected. The stone foundations are still solid. The position commands the entire valley. With the right preparations, a smaller force could hold this ground against a much larger attacking force. Morrison studied the map more carefully, his military training evident in the way he assessed the tactical possibilities. The approach routes are limited by the mountain terrain. Good fields of fire from elevated positions, natural barriers, to prevent flanking maneuvers. He looked up at Catherine with new respect. You have a good eye for defensive terrain, Miss Hayes. Where did you learn about military tactics? My father was a chaplain in the Union Army, Catherine replied. I spent my childhood in military camps, listening to officers discuss strategy around our dinner table. And I've read every account of frontier warfare I could find since arriving. In Colorado, Thomas was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're suggesting we rebuild Silver Creek as a military outpost. I'm suggesting we rebuild Silver Creek as a community that can defend itself, Catherine clarified. Not just a military outpost, but a real town that happens to be strategically positioned and well defended. Captain Morrison was nodding slowly. It's not impossible. The location is excellent, and we could provide military support during the construction phase, but it would require civilian volunteers willing to take significant risks. You'd have to, Catherine said firmly, looking directly at Thomas. If Marshal Garrett is willing to consider an alternative to hunting raiders alone in the wilderness. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the map to the ruins around them to Catherine's determined face. She could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression, the desire for revenge, warring against the possibility of something more constructive. It would mean giving up the hunt, he said finally, focusing on defense instead of pursuit. It would mean choosing to save lives instead of taking them, Catherine replied, building something instead of destroying something, creating a future instead of avenging the past. Morrison watched this exchange with growing interest. Marshal, you know this territory better than any of my men. If you were willing to lead this effort, I could provide engineering support, weapons, and periodic patrols. The territorial government might even provide funding for rebuilding if they saw it as a strategic defense project. The possibility hung in the air between them, tantalizing in its potential, but daunting in its scope. Catherine could see Thomas weighing the risks against the opportunities, the personal cost against the broader benefits. What about supplies? Thomas asked. Building materials, food, medical supplies. We'd need enough to sustain a settlement through construction and the first winter. The territorial government has been looking for ways to establish permanent defensive positions along the mining routes, Morrison replied. A project like this might qualify for emergency appropriations, and I know several cavalry officers who've been talking about retirement, men with families who might be interested in helping establish a secure settlement. Catherine felt excitement building in her chest. This was more than just a plan to rebuild Silver Creek. It was a vision of creating something entirely new, a community designed from the beginning to be both defensible and livable. There are other considerations, she said, her mind racing, with possibilities. If we're going to attract families, we need more than just defensive positions. We need a school, a church, businesses. We need to create a place people would want to live, not just survive. Thomas looked at her with something approaching amazement. Yesterday you'd never seen Silver Creek. Now you're planning to rebuild it from scratch. Yesterday I thought I was coming to step into someone else's life, Catherine replied. Today I'm realizing I might have the chance to help create something entirely new, something better than what was here before. Captain Morrison was studying the map again, his tactical mind working through the practical details. The timeline would be critical. We'd need to complete basic fortifications before winter, establish supply lines, recruit settlers. It's ambitious, but not impossible. How long do we have before the raiders reach Silverton? Catherine asked. Thomas considered this carefully. Based on their current pattern, probably 6 to 8 weeks. But if they hear about reconstruction efforts at Silver Creek, they might change their timeline. This valley would be too strategically important to leave unconquered. Then we'd be putting a target on our backs from the moment we started building, Morrison said grimly. We already have a target on our backs, Thomas pointed out. The question is whether we want to face the raiders from a position of strength or weakness. Catherine felt the momentum of the conversation shifting toward commitment, toward action. But she could also see the doubt in Thomas's eyes, the fear that he was being asked to risk failure again, to take responsibility for other people's safety when he'd already proven himself incapable of protecting those he cared about. Thomas, she said softly, moving closer to him, this isn't about replacing what was lost. This is about creating something new, something stronger, something that can't be destroyed by one dawn attack. And if I fail again? Thomas asked quietly. If my plans get more people killed, then we'll have failed together trying to build something good, Catherine replied. But if we don't try, if we just let the raiders continue picking off settlements one by one, then we've guaranteed failure for everyone. Captain Morrison sensed the personal undercurrents in their conversation and tactfully moved away, giving them space to work through their decision privately. Catherine, Thomas said, his voice heavy with uncertainty, you're asking me to bet everything on a plan that might be impossible. To take responsibility for other people's lives when I couldn't even protect the people who were already here. I'm asking you to bet everything on a plan that might save lives, Catherine corrected. And I'm not asking you to take responsibility alone. I'm asking you to share it with me, with Captain Morrison, with everyone who chooses to be part of this. Thomas looked around at the ruins of Silver Creek, and Catherine could see him beginning to envision something different. Not just rebuilt buildings, but a community designed to endure, to protect itself, to thrive despite the dangers of the frontier. It would have to be done right, he said finally. Not just thrown together, but planned carefully. Defensive positions integrated with civilian buildings. Multiple escape routes, underground storage for supplies. Everything the original Silver Creek lacked. Catherine felt her heart leap at the conditional acceptance in his voice. You're considering it. I'm considering whether it's possible to honor the dead by protecting the living instead of avenging them, Thomas replied. Whether there's a way to make their sacrifice mean something more than just another reason for violence. Captain Morrison rejoined their conversation, clearly having reached his own conclusions about the viability of the plan. Marshal, if you're willing to lead this effort, I can have survey engineers here within the week. We can assess the existing foundations, plan the defensive improvements, establish supply routes from Fort Collins. What about settlers? Catherine asked. We'll need families willing to take the risk, people with the skills to build a functioning community. There are always people looking for a new start, Morrison replied. Discharged soldiers, widows, and orphans from back east, farmers whose land played out. The promise of free land and military protection would attract plenty of volunteers. Thomas was studying the map again, but Catherine could see his focus had shifted from tracking radar movements to envisioning construction possibilities. We'd need to start with the basic fortifications: a stockade wall, elevated firing positions, secure gates, then work outward: houses, businesses, community buildings. How long would it take? Catherine asked. With enough men and materials. We could have basic defenses in place within a month, Morrison estimated. A functioning settlement within 3 months, but it would require total commitment from everyone involved. Catherine looked at Thomas, waiting for his decision. She could see him wrestling with the magnitude of what they were discussing. Not just rebuilding a town, but creating a new model for frontier settlement, one designed to survive and thrive in hostile territory. There's something else to consider, Thomas said slowly. If we do this, if we succeed in creating a defensible community, it changes the entire dynamic of frontier settlement. Other towns could adopt similar approaches. The raiders' advantage disappears. You're talking about more than just rebuilding Silver Creek, Catherine realized. You're talking about changing how the entire territory approaches defense and settlement. Exactly. Instead of scattered, vulnerable communities hoping the cavalry can protect them, we'd have networks of mutually supporting settlements who can defend themselves. Thomas's voice was gaining strength and conviction as he spoke. It could be the beginning of real security for the entire Colorado territory. Captain Morrison was nodding enthusiastically. The territorial government has been looking for exactly this kind of solution. A successful model here could be replicated throughout the frontier regions. Catherine felt the scope of their undertaking expanding beyond anything she'd imagined. What had started as a conversation about rebuilding one destroyed town was becoming a discussion about transforming the entire approach to frontier settlement and defense. It's a big responsibility, she said quietly. It's the right responsibility, Thomas replied, and Catherine could hear in his voice the echo of the man who'd written those hopeful letters, the man who'd believed in building something lasting and meaningful. Captain Morrison extended his hand to Thomas. So we agreed. You'll lead the reconstruction effort, and I'll provide military support and territorial backing? Thomas looked at Catherine one more time, searching her face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. She met his gaze steadily, her own commitment unwavering. We're agreed, Thomas said, shaking Morrison's hand firmly. But I have conditions. This has to be done as a true partnership, military and civilian working together. And Catherine Hayes has to be recognized as my co-leader in the civilian aspects of the project. Catherine felt a surge of warmth at Thomas's public acknowledgement of her role and capabilities. Co-leader? You're the one who saw the possibilities I couldn't see, Thomas said simply. You're the one who understood that building something new was better than avenging something lost. If we're going to make this work, I need your vision and your planning skills as much as I need Morrison's military support. Captain Morrison looked between them with approval. Miss Hayes, I'd be honored to have you as part of the leadership team. Your tactical insights this morning were impressive, and frontier settlements always benefit from strong women's leadership. Catherine felt tears starting in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she'd found something she'd never even known she was looking for. Not just a husband or a home, but a purpose that matched her capabilities and ambitions. Then let's begin, she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. We have a town to build and a future to create, as the three of them spread out the map. Again, this time to plan construction instead of track raiders, Catherine felt the weight of the past beginning to lift from her shoulders. The journey that had brought her to the ruins of Silver Creek had ended, but the journey to build something new and strong and lasting was just beginning. The sun climbed higher over the Colorado mountains, burning away the morning mist and revealing the valley in sharp, clear detail. In the growing light, The ruins of Silver Creek looked less like a graveyard and more like the foundation for something unprecedented, a community that would prove that hope and determination could triumph over violence and destruction. And for the first time since receiving Thomas's letters back in Boston, Catherine Hayes felt certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. 2 weeks into the reconstruction of Silver Creek, the first wave of settlers began arriving, and with them, the first signs of serious opposition to Catherine and Thomas's ambitious plans. The morning started promisingly enough, with a wagon train of 12 families rolling into the valley under military escort, their faces bright with hope and determination. Catherine stood beside Thomas at the half-built gate of their emerging stockade, watching as Captain Morrison's men helped the newcomers establish temporary camps among the construction sites. The past 2 weeks had transformed the ruins dramatically. Where once only blackened timber and ash had marked the town's location, now sturdy log walls rose steadily skyward, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed from dawn to dusk. "The Henderson family from Kansas," Thomas said, consulting the list of expected arrivals, "lost their farm to locusts. The Kowalskis from Ohio, both parents are teachers. The Martinez family from New Mexico Territory. He's a blacksmith, she's a seamstress. Good mix of skills." Catherine nodded, but her attention was caught by a figure standing apart from the arriving families. A tall, well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, was surveying the construction with an expression of obvious disapproval. "Who's that?" she asked, nodding toward the stranger. Thomas followed her gaze, and his expression darkened. "Jeremiah Blackwood. He owns the largest mining operation in the territory, based out of Denver. What's he doing here?" Their question was answered when Blackwood approached them directly, flanked by 2 men who looked more like gunfighters than miners. His greeting was cordial, but carried an undertone of menace that made Catherine instinctively step closer to Thomas. "Marshal Garrett," Blackwood said, extending a hand that Thomas shook with obvious reluctance, "and you must be the famous Miss Hayes I've been hearing about, the lady with the grand plans for rebuilding Silver Creek." "Mr. Blackwood," Catherine replied carefully, "I wasn't expecting to see mining interests represented among our settlers." Blackwood smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm not here to settle, Miss Hayes. I'm here to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your project." Thomas crossed his arms, his stance becoming defensive. "What kind of concerns?" "Well, for starters, the territorial government is wondering whether it's wise to invest significant resources in a location that's already proven vulnerable to attack." Blackwood gestured at the construction around them. "Some people are calling this an expensive mistake waiting to happen." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "The territorial government approved this project. Captain Morrison has full authority. Captain Morrison has authority over military matters," Blackwood interrupted smoothly. "But the funding for civilian infrastructure comes through different channels that require approval from the Territorial Business Council, which you sit on," Thomas said grimly. "Which I chair," Blackwood corrected, "and I'm afraid there are serious questions about the viability of this entire undertaking." Catherine could feel the careful structure of their plans beginning to shake. Without territorial funding, they'd be dependent entirely on military supplies, and whatever resources the settlers brought with them, nowhere near enough to complete the ambitious fortification and community development they'd envisioned. "What specific objections does the council have?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Blackwood pulled out a leather portfolio, extracting several official-looking documents. "First, there's the question of leadership. The territorial government typically requires established credentials for project directors, military experience, prior administrative positions, formal education in relevant fields. He looked directly at Catherine as he spoke. Some council members are concerned about placing significant territorial resources under the direction of unproven leadership. The insult was clear, though carefully couched in bureaucratic language. Catherine felt heat rising in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Thomas stepped forward. "Miss Hayes has proven herself repeatedly over the past 2 weeks," he said firmly. "Her strategic planning is the reason this project exists at all, and her organizational skills are the reason. We've made the progress we have. I'm sure she's very capable within her sphere," Blackwood replied condescendingly, "but territorial policy requires documented qualifications for major infrastructure projects. It's a matter of fiscal responsibility." Catherine realized with growing anger that this wasn't really about qualifications or fiscal responsibility. This was about power, specifically about certain interests not wanting to see a successful model of independent frontier development that didn't rely on their control. "What other objections does the council have?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "There's the matter of strategic positioning," Blackwood continued, consulting his documents. "Some military advisors question whether Silver Creek is the optimal location for a major defensive installation. They argue that resources might be better invested in strengthening existing settlements." Catherine knew this was a lie. Captain Morrison had specifically praised Silver Creek's strategic advantages, and the military engineers who'd surveyed the site had confirmed its defensive potential. But she also understood that contradicting Blackwood directly would likely make their situation worse. "I'd be interested to hear which military advisors raised those concerns," Thomas said carefully. "Colonel Harrison from Fort Carson has expressed reservations," Blackwood replied, "as has Major Phillips from the Territorial Militia. They've recommended that the project be reconsidered." Catherine felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. If senior military officers were questioning the project, it would be much harder for Captain Morrison to maintain support from his superiors. "There's also the question of the raider threat," Blackwood continued. "Some council members wonder whether it's wise to concentrate so many families in a location that's already been targeted for attack. The liability concerns alone are significant. The whole point of this project is to create a settlement that can defend itself against raider attacks," Catherine said, unable to keep the frustration out of her voice. "In theory, yes," Blackwood agreed. "But theory and practice are often very different things. If this experiment fails, if families are killed because the territorial government encouraged them to settle in a dangerous location, the political consequences would be severe." Thomas was studying Blackwood with the careful attention of a lawman who'd learned to read criminal intentions. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackwood?" "The council is prepared to offer alternative arrangements," Blackwood said, his tone becoming more businesslike. "We could relocate these families to established settlements with proven security. The territorial government would cover all moving expenses, provide land grants, even offer employment opportunities in existing mining operations." Catherine realized with dawning horror what was really happening. This wasn't just bureaucratic opposition. This was a deliberate effort to shut down their project before it could prove successful. "And what happens to Silver Creek?" she asked. Blackwood shrugged. "The site would be abandoned, as it probably should have been after the original attack. The military resources could be redirected to more viable defensive positions." "Leaving the entire southern approach to the mining camps undefended," Thomas observed. "Leaving it to be defended by established military protocols rather than experimental civilian projects," Blackwood corrected. Catherine felt anger building in her chest, but also a cold, calculating fury that surprised her with its intensity. She'd seen this pattern before. Powerful interests using bureaucracy and fear to shut down anything that threatened their control or offered alternatives to their dominance. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "I appreciate the Council's concerns, but I think there may be some misunderstandings about the nature and scope of our project here." Both men looked at her with surprise at her suddenly diplomatic tone. "For instance," Catherine continued, "the Council seems to be operating under the assumption that Silver Creek is primarily a territorial government project, subject to their oversight and approval." "Isn't it?" Blackwood asked, clearly confused by her direction. "Actually, no," Catherine replied, pulling out her own set of documents, papers she'd been carrying since Boston, but hadn't had occasion to use. According to the Homestead Act and territorial land laws, this site was legally claimed by the original settlers of Silver Creek. When the town was destroyed, those claims didn't disappear. They transferred to the legal heirs. She handed Blackwood a carefully folded document. "Thomas Garrett, as the duly appointed Marshal and legal representative of Silver Creek, holds title to the town site and has full authority to authorize reconstruction and settlement." Blackwood examined the document with growing displeasure. "This is technically correct, but it doesn't address the question of territorial funding, which we're no longer requesting," Catherine interrupted smoothly. "We've received private investment commitments that will fully fund the reconstruction project." This was a complete bluff. They had no such commitments, but Catherine delivered it with such confidence that even Thomas looked surprised. "Private investment?" Blackwood's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "From whom?" "From investors who understand the strategic and economic value of a successfully defended frontier settlement," Catherine replied. "People who recognize that Silver Creek represents a new model for territorial development, one that doesn't require ongoing dependence on distant government bureaucracy." She could see Blackwood's mind working, trying to assess whether her claims were real and what they might mean for his own interests. "Even if you have private funding," he said finally, "you still need territorial approval for major construction projects. Building permits, safety inspections, compliance with territorial building codes, all of which apply to territorial land," Thomas interjected, understanding Catherine's strategy. "But Silver Creek is incorporated under federal homestead law, which gives us considerable autonomy in local construction standards." Catherine felt a surge of gratitude for Thomas's quick understanding and support. Together, they were presenting a united front that Blackwood clearly hadn't expected. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood said, his composure beginning to crack. "The territorial government has legitimate oversight responsibilities." "Which we respect completely," Catherine agreed. "But those responsibilities don't extend to preventing legitimate settlers from building homes on legally claimed land, especially when those settlers aren't requesting territorial funding or support." Blackwood looked between them with growing anger. "You're making a serious mistake if you think you can operate independently of territorial authority. There are regulations, safety requirements, legal obligations that can't be ignored." "We have no intention of ignoring legitimate legal requirements," Thomas said firmly, "but we also have no intention of allowing bureaucratic obstruction to prevent us from protecting these families and rebuilding this community." Catherine could see that Blackwood was realizing his initial strategy had failed. The threat of withdrawn funding carried no weight if they weren't dependent on territorial money, and the bureaucratic obstacles he'd planned to deploy were largely irrelevant if they were operating under federal homestead authority. "There are other considerations," Blackwood said, his tone becoming more openly threatening. "Questions of business licensing, territorial trade regulations, mining rights. Silver Creek sits on land that could contain significant mineral deposits. The territorial government has a responsibility to ensure proper resource development." Now the real issue was emerging. Catherine realized that Blackwood's opposition wasn't just about control, it was about access to potential mineral wealth. In the Silver Creek Valley, are you suggesting that this opposition is really about mining claims? She asked directly. I'm suggesting that the territorial government has multiple interests to balance, Blackwood replied carefully. Economic development, resource management, public safety. A civilian settlement might interfere with optimal land use. Thomas stepped forward, his lawman's instincts fully engaged. Mr. Blackwood, are you here in your capacity as chairman of the Territorial Business Council or as owner of Blackwood Mining? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine could see Blackwood weighing his response, trying to decide how much of his true motivations to reveal. I'm here representing legitimate territorial interests, he said finally. That's not an answer, Thomas pressed. Are you here to shut down our settlement because it interferes with your business plans? Blackwood's facade of bureaucratic concern finally cracked completely. You're damn right I'm here because of business concerns. You people have no idea what you're playing with. This valley could contain millions of dollars in silver deposits, and you want to turn it into some kind of farming commune. So this is about mining rights, Catherine said, feeling pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This is about responsible development of territorial resources, Blackwood snapped. About preventing a handful of idealistic fools from interfering with economic progress that could benefit the entire territory. Catherine felt her anger crystallizing into cold determination. Mr. Blackwood, I think you should know that we've already filed mineral claims on behalf of the Silver Creek settlement. Any mining operations in this valley will be controlled by the community, not outside interests. This was another bluff, but Catherine delivered it with the same confidence as the first. She could see from Blackwood's expression that he believed her, and that the possibility terrified him. You can't do that, he said, his voice rising. Those claims would have to be filed with the Territorial Mining Authority, which we did. Yesterday, Thomas said, backing Catherine's play without hesitation. Full documentation of community-controlled mineral rights, properly filed and witnessed. Blackwood stared at them for a long moment, his face flushing with anger. When he spoke again, his voice carried an unmistakable menace. You people have no idea what you're up against. The territorial government has ways of dealing with troublemakers who don't understand their place. Regulations can be enforced strictly, safety inspections can be very thorough, business licenses can be delayed indefinitely. Are you threatening us? Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the fear beginning to build in her chest. I'm informing you of reality, Blackwood replied. This territory operates according to certain understandings, certain arrangements between responsible parties. People who disrupt those arrangements often find life difficult. Thomas's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Mr. Blackwood, I think you've said enough. Blackwood glanced at Thomas's movement and smiled coldly. Marshal Garrett, you might want to remember that your authority extends only to local law. Enforcement. There are larger forces at work here than one small-town lawman can handle. He turned to leave, then paused to deliver a final warning. You have families arriving, children who depend on you for protection. I'd hate to see them suffer because their leaders made poor decisions about who to oppose. As Blackwood and his men rode away from Silver Creek, Catherine felt the weight of what they'd just committed to settling on her shoulders. In the space of a single conversation, they'd made powerful enemies, claimed resources they didn't control, and promised financing they didn't have. Catherine, Thomas said quietly, watching the riders disappear over the ridge. Please tell me you have some kind of plan for backing up those claims we just made. Catherine looked around at the construction sites, at the families setting up their temporary camps, at the children playing among the building materials. All of these people were depending on her and Thomas to keep the promises they'd made, promises that were looking increasingly impossible to fulfill. "I'm working on it," she said, hoping her voice carried more confidence than she felt. But as she watched Blackwood's dust cloud fade into the distance, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just declared war on forces much more powerful and ruthless than they'd realized. The question now was whether they could build their defenses fast enough to survive the coming assault. 3 days after Blackwood's departure, the full extent of his influence became devastatingly clear. Catherine stood in the morning sun, outside the half-built community hall, reading the official notice that had arrived with the dawn supply wagon from Fort Collins. Her hands shook as she absorbed the implications of the territorial government's new decree. "Thomas," she called, her voice tight with controlled panic, "you need to see this." Thomas emerged from the construction site where he'd been working with the Henderson family to raise the frame of their new house. Sweat darkened his shirt, despite the cool mountain air, and sawdust clung to his dark hair. The past week of physical labor had restored some color to his gaunt cheeks, but Catherine could see the old haunted look returning as he read the document over her shoulder. "By order of the Colorado Territorial Authority," Thomas read aloud, his voice growing grimmer with each word. "All construction activities in the Silver Creek Valley are hereby suspended, pending comprehensive safety and environmental impact assessments. All residents are advised to evacuate immediately to approved settlements until such assessments are completed." Catherine felt sick to her stomach. "There's more," Thomas continued reading. "Any persons remaining in the Silver Creek area after sunset on October 15th will be considered in violation of territorial safety regulations and subject to immediate removal by territorial marshals." He looked up, his face pale. "That's tomorrow night." The sound of hammering and sawing throughout the settlement began to slow as word of the evacuation order spread from family to family. Catherine could see confusion and fear spreading across the faces of people who had uprooted their entire lives to be part of this new beginning. "Mrs. Hayes! Marshal Garrett!" Maria Martinez approached at a near run, her youngest child clutched in her arms and panic evident in her voice. "Is it true? Are they really going to force us to leave?" Before Catherine could answer, other families began gathering around them. The Kowalski children pressed close to their parents, sensing the adults' distress. Old Henrik Johansson, who had been a foreman in the Pennsylvania coal mines before coming west, spoke for many of them. "We sold everything to come here," he said, his accented English heavy with emotion. "Our farm, our livestock, everything we owned. If we leave now, we have nothing to go back to." Catherine felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her shoulders. These families had trusted her vision, had believed in her promises of a secure future in Silver Creek. Now that future was being stripped away by bureaucratic maneuvering that she'd failed to anticipate or prevent. "We're going to fight this," she said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "This order is based on false pretenses. We have legal rights." "Do we?" interrupted Sarah Kowalski, the former teacher whose steady demeanor had made her a natural leader among the women. "Because from where I stand, it looks like we've been outmaneuvered by people with more power and better lawyers than we have." The brutal honesty of the assessment hit Catherine like a physical blow. Sarah was right. They'd been playing a game whose rules they didn't fully understand against opponents who controlled the board. Thomas stepped closer to Catherine, his presence steadying despite his own obvious concerns. "Everyone needs to stay calm while we figure out our options. Sarah, can you organize the families to secure any valuable materials and supplies? Hendrik, work with the other men to make sure our tools and equipment are protected. We're not giving up, but we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." As the families dispersed to follow Thomas's instructions, Catherine felt a moment of Profound gratitude for his leadership. Even in crisis, he was thinking tactically, keeping people focused and productive instead of allowing panic to take hold. "What are our actual legal options?" Thomas asked quietly once they were alone. Catherine pulled out the portfolio she'd been carrying since her confrontation with Blackwood, spreading the documents on a makeshift table. "Honestly, they're limited. The territorial government has broad emergency powers, and they're claiming this is a public safety issue, even though we know it's really about mining rights and political control. Knowing it and proving it are different things," Catherine said grimly. "And even if we could prove it, we'd need access to territorial courts, which could take months. These families can't wait months." Thomas studied the evacuation order more carefully, his lawman's training evident in the way he parsed the legal language. "There might be a loophole here. Look at this section about approved settlements. It doesn't specify that residents have to leave the county, just that they have to relocate to approved areas." Catherine followed his reasoning. "You're thinking we could establish a temporary camp somewhere nearby while we fight the order?" "I'm thinking we could establish a permanent settlement somewhere nearby that doesn't fall under Silver Creek's specific territorial designation," Thomas replied. "The land grants and homestead rights we discussed aren't limited to this exact location." Hope flickered in Catherine's chest. "The northern end of the valley. It's technically outside the Silver Creek Township boundaries, but still defensible and close to water." "Exactly. We could relocate there, maintain our community structure, and continue building while challenging the evacuation order through proper legal channels." Catherine felt her mind racing through the possibilities and complications. It would mean starting over again, new construction, new defensive positions, new supply routes. "And there's no guarantee Blackwood won't find ways to challenge us there too." "There's no guarantee of anything," Thomas agreed. "But it gives us options, keeps the families together, and maintains our ability to defend ourselves if the raiders do show up." Their planning was interrupted by the arrival of another wagon, this one bearing official territorial markings and escorted by 6 armed men wearing territorial Marshal badges. Catherine felt her heart sink as she recognized the lead rider, Deputy Marshal William Crawford, a man with a reputation for enforcing territorial authority with ruthless efficiency. Crawford dismounted with deliberate ceremony, clearly enjoying the attention his arrival had drawn from the entire settlement. He was a large man, with silver hair and cold grey eyes, wearing the kind of expensive clothes that spoke of comfortable corruption rather than honest law enforcement. "Marshal Garrett," Crawford said, his voice carrying easily across the construction sites. "I trust you've received the territorial evacuation order?" "I have," Thomas replied carefully, "and I have some questions about its legal basis." Crawford smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "The legal basis is simple, Marshal. The territorial government has determined that this location poses unacceptable risks to civilian safety. All residents must evacuate to approved settlements immediately." "And what specific risks have been identified?" Catherine asked, stepping forward to stand beside Thomas. Crawford's gaze shifted to her with obvious disdain. "Miss Hayes, isn't it? I understand you've been instrumental in organizing this experiment. I'm afraid your lack of experience in territorial law is showing." The condescending tone was clearly calculated to humiliate her in front of the families who had looked to her for leadership. Catherine felt anger flare, but she forced herself to respond calmly. "My experience in territorial law may be limited," she said evenly, "but my understanding of constitutional rights is quite solid. These families have legal homestead claims that can't be arbitrarily revoked by territorial bureaucrats." Crawford's smile widened. "Ah, but they can be suspended pending safety assessments, which is exactly what's happening here." He pulled out his own set of documents, clearly prepared for this exact conversation. "The Territorial Engineering Office has identified numerous safety hazards in this location. unstable geological conditions due to potential underground mining activity, inadequate water supply for a settlement of this size, insufficient natural barriers to provide protection against hostile forces. Catherine realized with growing alarm that each of these objections had been carefully crafted to sound legitimate while being nearly impossible to refute quickly. Geological surveys would take weeks, water supply assessments would require expensive engineering studies, and defensive capability evaluations could be endlessly delayed by bureaucratic procedures. These assessments weren't required when Silver Creek was originally settled, Thomas pointed out. Silver Creek was established before current territorial safety standards were implemented, Crawford replied smoothly. Standards that exist because of tragedies like the one that destroyed the original settlement. The logical trap was elegant and vicious. By referencing the raider attack that had destroyed Silver Creek, Crawford was using the community's own tragedy as justification for preventing its rebuilding. Furthermore, Crawford continued, there are questions about the leadership structure of this settlement. Territorial policy requires that major construction projects be overseen by individuals with documented qualifications and experience. His gaze fixed on Catherine again. I understand that Miss Hayes has been presenting herself as a project co-director despite having no relevant credentials or experience in territorial development. Catherine felt the familiar sting of having her capabilities questioned because of her gender and background. But this time, the personal attack was being used as a weapon against the entire community. Miss Hayes has proven her competence repeatedly, Thomas said firmly. Her strategic planning and organizational skills are the reason this project has been successful. Success is measured by results, Marshal Garrett, Crawford replied, and the result here is a half-built settlement that violates territorial safety standards and puts civilian families at unnecessary risk. Catherine could see the families listening to this exchange with growing concern. Crawford's authoritative manner and official credentials carried weight that her passionate advocacy couldn't match. What specific steps would be required to address these safety concerns? She asked, trying to find some path forward. Crawford consulted his documents with theatrical precision. Full geological survey by certified territorial engineers. Hydrological assessment by qualified water management specialists. Military evaluation of defensive capabilities by territorial defense authorities. Environmental impact studies. Legal review of all land claims and construction permits. Each requirement would cost thousands of dollars and take months to complete, resources the community didn't have and time they couldn't afford. And how long would these assessments take, Thomas asked. 18 to 24 months, assuming no complications or additional requirements are identified during the process. The timeline was devastating. No community could survive that long in limbo, especially with winter approaching and no permanent shelter established. Catherine felt the careful structure of everything they'd built beginning to collapse. The families had trusted her vision and Thomas's leadership, but now they were facing the reality that good intentions and hard work weren't enough to overcome entrenched political and economic power. There is an alternative, Crawford said, his tone becoming almost sympathetic. The territorial government has identified several approved settlements that could accommodate these families immediately. Full relocation assistance, land grants, even employment opportunities with established territorial businesses. Catherine realized this was the final piece of Blackwood's strategy. After making it impossible for the families to stay in Silver Creek, he was offering them alternatives that would disperse them to locations where they couldn't threaten his mining interests or serve as examples of independent community development. What about our investment in this location? Henrik Johansson asked. The work we've done, the materials we've brought here. The territorial government recognizes the hardship this situation creates, Crawford replied. There would be compensation for documented losses, plus relocation assistance to help families establish themselves in approved settlements. Catherine could see the appeal of the offer. Instead of facing an uncertain legal battle with their own resources against powerful opponents, the families could accept government assistance to start over in locations where they wouldn't face bureaucratic harassment. But she also understood that accepting this offer would mean abandoning everything they'd worked toward, not just the physical construction, but the vision of an independent, defensible community that could serve as a model for other frontier settlements. "How long do we have to make this decision?" Thomas asked. "The evacuation order takes effect at sunset tomorrow," Crawford replied. "Any families remaining after that time will be subject to forcible removal." The ultimatum was clear and final. 24 hours to abandon everything they'd built and accept dispersal to communities where they'd be dependent on territorial authority instead of their own collective strength. "And if we challenge this order through legal channels?" Crawford's expression hardened. "Marshal Garrett, I'd strongly advise against that course of action. The territorial government has significant resources and considerable patience for dealing with troublemakers. Families who find themselves on the wrong side of territorial authority often discover that life in Colorado Territory can become very difficult." The threat was unmistakable, though carefully couched in official language. Catherine felt a chill as she realized they were facing not just bureaucratic opposition, but potential retaliation against anyone who continued to resist. "We need time to discuss this with the families," she said. "Of course," Crawford agreed. "But I want to be very clear about the timeline. Sunset tomorrow. After that, territorial marshals will enforce the evacuation order by whatever means necessary." As Crawford and his men rode away from Silver Creek, Catherine felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. Every option seemed to lead to the destruction of what they'd worked so hard to build. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I think I've led these families into a trap they can't escape." Thomas took her hand, his grip warm and steady, despite the chaos surrounding them. "We've led them towards something better than what they had before. That's not a trap, Catherine. That's hope. And we're not giving up on it without a fight." But as the sun began its descent toward the Colorado peaks, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that their time for fighting was running out faster than they could find weapons to defend themselves with. As the sun reached its zenith on what might be their last day in Silver Creek, Catherine stood before the assembled families with a proposal that could either save their community or destroy it completely. The past 18 hours had been a whirlwind of desperate planning, heated debates, and careful research that had revealed a possibility none of them had previously considered. "I know this sounds impossible," Catherine said, her voice carrying across the circle of worried faces gathered in the half-built community hall. "But I believe we can turn Blackwood's own tactics against him." Thomas stood beside her, his expression mixing hope with deep concern. They'd spent the entire night poring over territorial laws, federal statutes, and mining regulations, searching for any legal avenue that might allow them to remain in Silver Creek. What they'd discovered was both promising and terrifying. "The key," Catherine continued, "is understanding what Blackwood really wants. It's not just about controlling the mining rights in this valley. It's about preventing any model of independent community development that doesn't rely on his business interests." Maria Martinez raised her hand, her infant daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the tension surrounding them. "Mrs. Hayes, we appreciate everything you've done, but we have children to think about. If the territorial marshals come tonight—" "They won't," Catherine said with more confidence than she felt, "because we're going to give them a reason they can't." She gestured to Thomas, who spread out a detailed map of the Silver Creek Valley on the makeshift table they'd constructed from salvaged lumber. "Here's what we've discovered," Thomas said, his finger tracing the boundaries marked on the map. "The territorial evacuation order specifically references Silver Creek as a township under territorial jurisdiction, but according to federal homestead law, we have the right to incorporate as an independent municipality once we meet certain population and development requirements." Henrik Johansson leaned forward, his coal mining experience making him naturally skeptical of legal technicalities. "And do we meet those requirements?" "We do," Catherine replied, pulling out a thick folder of documents they'd prepared through the night. 47 permanent residents, which exceeds the federal minimum of 25 adult citizens. Established infrastructure including residential, commercial and civic buildings. A functioning local government structure with elected leadership. But we haven't actually held elections, Sarah Kowalski pointed out. "We're going to," Thomas said, "right now, before the territorial marshals return." Catherine could see the mixture of hope and confusion on the faces around her. "What we're proposing is that Silver Creek incorporate as an independent federal municipality under the provisions of the Homestead Act and the Territorial Organic Act. As a federal municipality, we'd be outside the direct administrative control of the territorial government." "That sounds too good to be true," said James Henderson, the Kansas farmer whose practical nature had made him valuable during construction. "What's the catch?" Catherine took a deep breath. "The catch is that incorporation requires us to assume full responsibility for our own governance, defense, and economic development. No territorial support, no military protection from Fort Collins, no assistance with supplies or infrastructure. And if Blackwood challenges our incorporation, then we fight him in federal court instead of territorial court," Thomas replied. "Federal judges are appointed from Washington, not influenced by local business interests. We'd have a fair hearing." The silence that followed was heavy with consideration. Catherine could see families weighing the risks against the possibilities, trying to decide whether to gamble everything on a legal strategy that might protect them or might leave them completely isolated and vulnerable. "There's something else," Catherine said quietly. "If we incorporate as a federal municipality, we gain the right to issue our own mining permits and control mineral development within our boundaries." This got everyone's immediate attention. Henrik's eyes widened as he grasped the implications. "You mean we could control the silver mining ourselves, instead of letting outside companies strip the wealth and leave us with nothing?" "Exactly," Catherine confirmed. "Community-controlled mineral rights, with profits supporting local development instead of enriching distant investors." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Instead of discussing survival and evacuation, they were suddenly talking about economic independence and long-term prosperity. "But do we know enough about mining to make that work?" asked Peter Kowalski, the former teacher whose practical concerns had kept them grounded throughout the crisis. "Henrik does," Catherine replied, nodding toward the former coal foreman. "And there are others in Colorado Territory with mining experience who might join us if we can offer them something better than working for companies like Blackwood's operation." "A mining cooperative," Henrik said slowly, his accent thickening with excitement, "where the workers own shares in the operation instead of just drawing wages. I've heard of such things in Pennsylvania, but never seen one actually tried." Thomas checked his pocket watch. "We have 6 hours before Crawford returns with his enforcement team. If we're going to do this, we need to move fast." Catherine had prepared for this moment throughout the night, organizing the necessary steps. In her mind, first, we need to hold formal elections to establish legitimate municipal government. Second, we need to file incorporation papers with the Federal Territorial Office in Denver. Third, we need to establish our mineral claims and notify the Territorial Mining Authority of our new status. And fourth, Thomas added grimly. We need to be prepared to defend our decisions when Blackwood realizes what we've done. The voting took place immediately, with all adult residents participating in the selection of a mayor, town council, and municipal officers. Catherine found herself elected mayor by unanimous vote, while Thomas was chosen as town marshal and Henrik as mining superintendent. As the families worked to prepare and file the necessary paperwork, riders were dispatched to Denver with incorporation, documents, and legal notifications. Catherine had used the last of her personal savings to hire a federal attorney she'd corresponded with from Boston, a man with experience in territorial incorporation law who had agreed to represent them in any legal challenges. By late afternoon, Silver Creek existed as a legal entity independent of territorial administrative control. Catherine stood on the steps of their newly designated town hall, looking out over a community that had transformed itself in a matter of hours from refugees facing evacuation to citizens of their own independent municipality. But the real test was yet to come. Deputy Marshal Crawford arrived precisely at sunset, as promised, with a force of 12 territorial marshals prepared to enforce the evacuation order. Catherine watched from the town hall steps as the armed men rode into Silver Creek, expecting to find frightened families packing their belongings. Instead, they found the entire community gathered in the town square, with Catherine and Thomas, waiting to greet them in their newly elected official capacities. "Marshal Crawford," Catherine said formally as the deputy marshal dismounted. "Welcome to the incorporated municipality of Silver Creek, Colorado Territory." Crawford's expression shifted from confident authority to confusion and then to anger as he realized what had happened. "What kind of game are you playing, Miss Hayes?" "Mayor Hayes," Catherine corrected smoothly. "And this isn't a game. Silver Creek has incorporated as an independent federal municipality under the provisions of the Homestead Act. Your territorial evacuation order no longer applies to our jurisdiction." Crawford pulled out the evacuation decree, studying it with growing frustration. "This is some kind of legal trick. The territorial government has authority over all settlements within territorial boundaries. Not over incorporated federal municipalities," Thomas replied, stepping forward in his official capacity as town marshal. "Federal law supersedes territorial administrative authority in matters of municipal incorporation." Catherine handed Crawford a complete set of incorporation documents, including federal acknowledgement of their municipal status and recognition of their mineral rights claims. "These are duly filed and legally recognized," she explained. "Silver Creek is now outside the direct administrative control of the territorial government, though we remain subject to federal law and territorial judicial authority for criminal matters." Crawford's face flushed red as he realized the elegant trap they'd constructed. By incorporating as a federal municipality, they'd removed themselves from territorial administrative control while remaining within the legal framework of the territory. "Blackwood isn't going to stand for this," Crawford said, his official composure cracking to reveal the corrupt enforcer beneath. "Mr. Blackwood's opinions are irrelevant to our legal status," Catherine replied calmly. "Though if he wishes to challenge our incorporation, he's welcome to file suit in federal court." Crawford looked around at the assembled families, all of whom were watching this confrontation with determination rather than fear. The children stood close to their parents, but there was pride in their faces instead of terror. "You people don't know what you're up against," Crawford said finally. "Blackwood has resources, connections, influence. He can make life very difficult for troublemakers." "Deputy Marshal Crawford," Thomas said formally, "are you threatening the citizens of an incorporated federal municipality?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Crawford realized he'd overstepped his authority, making threats on behalf of private interests rather than enforcing legitimate territorial law. "I'm informing you of practical realities, Crawford replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The practical reality, Catherine said, is that Silver Creek is now a self-governing municipality with legal standing to defend its citizens' rights. Any attempts to intimidate or coerce our residents will be met with appropriate legal and, if necessary, physical resistance. Crawford remounted his horse, clearly frustrated by the complete failure of his mission. This isn't over. There are other ways to deal with communities that don't know their place. We know our place very well, Catherine replied. It's here, in the community we've built and legally established, and we intend to defend it. As Crawford and his men rode away from Silver Creek, the entire community erupted in celebration. Families embraced, children cheered, and even the normally reserved Henrik Johansson smiled broadly as he contemplated the possibilities of community-controlled mining operations. But Catherine felt no urge to celebrate yet. She knew Blackwood wouldn't accept this defeat gracefully, and there would be other challenges ahead. However, for the first time since arriving in the ruins of Silver Creek, she felt confident in their ability to meet whatever came next. "Mayor, in Hayes," Thomas said with a smile that transformed his serious features, "I believe congratulations are in order." "Not yet," Catherine replied, though she couldn't suppress her own smile. "We've won the right to exist, but we still have to prove we can thrive one challenge at a time," Thomas said, taking her hand in his. "We've got 47 people who believe in what we're building here. That's enough to start with." As the sun set behind the Colorado peaks, casting Silver Creek in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine looked around at the community she'd helped create and lead. The buildings were still half-finished, the challenges were still enormous, and the future was still uncertain. But they were no longer refugees or victims. They were citizens of their own community, with the legal right to determine their own destiny and the collective strength to defend it. The woman who had arrived in Silver Creek as a rejected mail-order bride had become the elected mayor of an independent municipality. The broken Marshal, haunted by his failures, had become the leader of a community determined to protect itself, and together they'd proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against entrenched authority is the simple determination to build something better, regardless of the obstacles placed in your way. The battle for Silver Creek's independence was won, but Catherine knew the war for their future was just beginning. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was eager to fight it. 6 months after the incorporation of Silver Creek, Catherine stood on the porch of the town hall on a crisp April morning, watching the most remarkable transformation she'd ever witnessed. Where once only ruins and ash had marked the valley floor, a thriving community now bustled with activity that spoke of permanence, prosperity, and hope. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the newly completed schoolhouse, where Sarah Kowalski taught lessons to 23 students whose families had arrived throughout the winter months. The rhythmic pounding of Henrik Johansson's expanded blacksmith shop provided a steady counterpoint to the distant rumble of the community-owned silver mine that had become the economic foundation of their success. Most remarkably of all, Catherine could see Thomas approaching along Main Street, returning from his morning patrol with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. The haunted look that had marked his features when she first arrived had been replaced by something she'd never dared hope to see: genuine happiness. "Mayor Hayes," called Maria Martinez from the general store across the street, where she was arranging a display of goods that would have impressed shoppers in Denver. "The territorial representative from Washington is here to see you." Catherine straightened her shoulders, smoothing the practical blue dress that had become her unofficial uniform as Silver Creek's first elected mayor. The visit from Congressman William Palmer had been scheduled for weeks, part of the federal government's interest in Silver Creek as a model for frontier community development. Inside the town hall, Catherine found Congressman Palmer examining the detailed maps and development, plans that covered one entire war. Palmer was a distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to important decisions, but his expression showed genuine fascination rather than political calculation. "Mrs. Hayes," Palmer said, rising to greet her with evident respect. "I must say what you've accomplished here is extraordinary. When I received the initial reports from the territorial office, I assumed they were exaggerated." "Please, have a seat, Congressman," Catherine replied, gesturing toward the conference table they'd built from local timber. "I'm eager to hear your assessment." Palmer consulted a leather portfolio filled with official documents. According to federal records, Silver Creek has achieved population growth of 400% since incorporation. Your community-controlled mining operation is producing silver at rates that exceed most corporate ventures. And perhaps most remarkably, you've had 0 serious crimes, 0 family departures, and 0 requests for federal assistance, despite being completely self-governing. Catherine felt pride swell in her chest, not just for herself, but for every resident who had contributed to Silver Creek's success. "We've been fortunate in the quality of families who've chosen to join us." "Fortunate, perhaps, but also selective," Palmer observed. "I understand you've established quite rigorous standards for new residents." This was true. As word of Silver Creek's success had spread throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, they'd received hundreds of applications from families wanting to join their community. But Catherine and the town council had learned to be careful about who they accepted. "We look for people who understand that community success requires individual commitment," Catherine explained. "Families willing to contribute skills, labor, and leadership rather than simply seeking benefits they haven't earned." Palmer nodded, approvingly. "And the result is a community with virtually no social problems and remarkable economic productivity. The federal government is very interested in understanding how your model might be replicated elsewhere." Catherine felt a familiar thrill at the possibility of Silver Creek's influence extending beyond their valley. "What specific aspects interest Washington most?" "The integration of democratic governance with economic cooperation," Palmer replied. "Most frontier settlements either depend entirely on external authority or devolve into lawlessness. You've created something entirely different, a community that governs itself effectively while maintaining harmony with federal and territorial law." Thomas entered the town hall at that moment, removing his hat and nodding respectfully to the congressman, before taking a seat beside Catherine. The easy partnership they'd developed in both personal and professional spheres had become one of Silver Creek's greatest strengths. "Marshal Garrett," Palmer said, "I'm particularly interested in your approach to law enforcement. According to territorial records, Silver Creek has one of the lowest crime rates in Colorado Territory, despite having only one full-time peace officer." Thomas smiled, the expression so different from the grim determination Catherine remembered from their early days together. "Crime prevention is easier when everyone in the community has a stake in maintaining order. When people own their homes, control their economic destiny, and participate in governance, they don't have much incentive to cause trouble. And when trouble does arise, community mediation first, formal legal proceedings only when necessary," Thomas replied. "Most disputes get resolved through discussion and compromise rather than punishment and enforcement." Palmer made detailed notes, clearly impressed by their practical approach to frontier justice. "What about external threats, the raider activity that originally destroyed Silver Creek?" Catherine and Thomas exchanged a glance that communicated volumes about shared memories and overcome challenges. "The raider threat ended 8 weeks after our incorporation," Catherine said. "Not because we defeated them in battle, but because We eliminated their primary motivation for attacking settlements. Palmer looked intrigued. How so? Thomas leaned forward, his strategic mind evident in the way he explained their success. Raiders targeted isolated, vulnerable communities that couldn't defend themselves and had wealth worth stealing. Silver Creek is neither isolated nor vulnerable, and our wealth is integrated into defensive structures rather than concentrated in easy targets. More importantly, Catherine added, we've established cooperative relationships with other settlements throughout the territory. Silver Creek serves as a supply and support hub for smaller communities, creating a mutual defense network that makes raider attacks unprofitable. Palmer's eyebrows rose. You've essentially created a regional security system based on economic cooperation rather than military force. Exactly. When communities are connected by trade relationships and mutual support agreements, attacking one means facing retaliation from all the others. The mathematics don't work in the raiders' favor anymore. The congressman spent the next 2 hours touring Silver Creek's facilities, meeting with residents, and documenting the various innovations that had made their community successful. Catherine accompanied him throughout, feeling deep satisfaction as she watched Palmer's amazement grow at each new discovery. At the silver mine, Henrik Johansson explained their cooperative ownership structure, where every working family held shares in the operation and received both wages and profit distributions. The arrangement had attracted some of the territory's most skilled miners, creating productivity levels that surpassed corporate operations while maintaining excellent safety standards. At the school, Sarah Kowalski demonstrated their educational approach, which combined traditional academics with practical skills training. Children learned mathematics through bookkeeping for local businesses, studied geography through mapping local resources, and practiced writing by corresponding with children in other communities throughout the territory. At the community workshops, Palmer observed the integrated approach to manufacturing and commerce that had made Silver Creek economically self-sufficient. The blacksmith shop produced tools and hardware for local use and regional trade. The carpenter shop built furniture and structures for expanding families. The textile workshop created clothing and household goods that had gained recognition throughout Colorado territory for their quality. What strikes me most, Palmer said as they returned to the town hall, is how every aspect of your community reinforces every other aspect. Economic success supports social stability, which enables effective governance, which creates conditions for further economic growth. That was intentional, Catherine replied. We learned from the failure of the original Silver Creek, that frontier. Communities can't survive as isolated collections of individual homesteads. Everything has to work together or nothing works at all. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had arrived in Silver Creek as a desperate widow seeking security through marriage had become the architect of a community that was reshaping how the American frontier approached settlement and development. Mrs. Hayes, Palmer said, as their formal meetings concluded, I want to discuss something that goes beyond my official assessment. Catherine sensed the importance of whatever was coming. Of course, Congressman. The federal government is planning major expansion of Western settlement over the next decade. We're going to need models, templates, proven approaches that can be replicated in different territories with different challenges. Palmer paused, choosing his words carefully. We'd like Silver Creek to serve as a training center for community leaders, a place where people can learn your methods before establishing similar communities elsewhere. The proposition was staggering in its implications. Silver Creek wouldn't just be a successful frontier community, it would become the foundation for a new approach to American expansion westward. What would that involve? Catherine asked. Federal. funding to expand your facilities, resources to document your methods and create training programs, and most importantly, recognition as an official federal model community with authority to certify other settlements as following your principles. Catherine felt excitement building, but also caution. What would be the obligations and restrictions? Periodic federal oversight to ensure you maintain the standards that make you successful, Palmer replied. Willingness to accept trainees and visitors who want to learn your methods, and commitment to supporting other communities that adopt your model. Thomas had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. Congressman, are you saying the federal government wants to use Silver Creek as a prototype for Western expansion? I'm saying Silver Creek has solved problems that have plagued frontier settlement since the first pioneers crossed the Mississippi, Palmer replied. The federal government would be foolish not to learn from your success. That evening, after Palmer had departed for Denver, Catherine and Thomas walked through Silver Creek streets in the soft light of early spring. Children played games in the town square, while their parents visited on front porches. Couples strolled hand in hand between the shops and businesses that comprise their thriving commercial district. Older residents sat on benches outside the community center, sharing stories and watching the next generation grow up in safety and prosperity. A year ago, this was all ash and rubble, Thomas said quietly, taking Catherine's hand as they paused beside the memorial they'd erected to honor the original Silver Creek's residents. A year ago, we were both broken people with no future beyond. Survival, Catherine replied. Look what we've built together. The memorial bore the names of all 43 people who had died in the raider attack, but it also carried an inscription that Catherine had written, "Their dreams live on in the community we build today." Do you think they'd approve? Thomas asked, a question he'd posed several times as Silver Creek had grown and prospered. I think they'd be amazed, Catherine replied. The original Silver Creek was a good community, but this one is something entirely different, something stronger, more integrated, more capable of protecting itself and helping others. They continued walking, eventually reaching the house they'd built together at the end of Main Street. It was larger than necessary for just the two of them, with extra bedrooms that they hoped to fill someday, and a study where Catherine handled the increasing correspondence that came with Silver Creek's growing reputation. Catherine, Thomas said as they reached their front gate, there's something I need to tell you. She looked at him with sudden concern, wondering if some new challenge was about to complicate their hard-won success. Palmer's offer, the federal recognition, the training center, it's going to change everything, Thomas continued. Silver Creek won't be our quiet little community anymore. We'll have visitors, trainees, federal officials, constant attention. Catherine nodded, having realized. The same thing during Palmer's visit. Are you having second thoughts? No, Thomas said firmly. But I am thinking about what it means for us personally, for our relationship, our future together. Catherine felt her heart begin to race, sensing the direction of his thoughts. We've been so focused on building this community that we haven't talked about building our own future within it, Thomas continued. About making the partnership official in all ways, not just professional. He reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that caught the lamplight from their front porch. Catherine Hayes, Thomas said, dropping to one knee. In the street they'd helped design and build, will you marry me? Not because you need security or I need a housekeeper, but because we've proven we can build something extraordinary together. Catherine felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked down at the man who had become not just her partner in rebuilding Silver Creek, but her partner in discovering what she was truly capable of achieving. Thomas Garrett, she said, her voice shaking with emotion, I'll marry you because I love the man you've become, the leader you've grown into, and the future we can create together. As Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, Catherine heard applause and cheering from around the square. Apparently, their proposal hadn't been as private as they'd thought. Several families had been watching from their porches and windows, and word was spreading quickly through the community. Within minutes, Silver Creek's residents were gathering in the street around them, offering congratulations and beginning spontaneous celebrations that would continue well into the night. "Looks like we're having a community engagement party," Thomas said, laughing as Henrik Johansson appeared with a fiddle, and Maria Martinez began organizing refreshments. "Looks like we're having a community celebration of everything we've accomplished together," Catherine corrected, looking around at the faces of people who had become not just neighbors, but extended family. As the evening progressed and the celebration grew, Catherine found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd left Boston as a desperate widow with no prospects beyond a marriage of convenience to a stranger. She'd arrived in Silver Creek to find nothing but ruins and a broken man consumed by guilt and revenge. But together, they'd built something that exceeded every dream she'd dared to harbor. Not just a successful community, but a model for how people could live together in mutual support and shared prosperity. Not just a marriage of convenience, but a partnership based on love, respect, and common purpose. And now, as Silver Creek prepared to become a beacon for other communities throughout the American frontier, Catherine knew that their greatest adventures still lay ahead. The woman who had once measured her worth by her ability to serve others' needs had become a leader whose vision was shaping the future of Western expansion. The broken Marshal, haunted by his failures, had become a lawman whose innovative approach to community security was being studied by federal officials as a model for the entire frontier. Together, they'd proven that sometimes the most powerful force for change isn't violence or wealth or political authority. Sometimes it's simply the determination to build something better than what existed before, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. As the celebration continued around them and the stars emerged over the Colorado mountains, Catherine and Thomas stood together in the middle of the community they'd created, surrounded by the people whose lives they'd helped transform, looking forward to a future limited only by their willingness to dream big and work hard to make those dreams reality. The mail-order bride who had come west seeking security had found something far more valuable: the chance to create a legacy that would influence American frontier development for generations to come. And in doing so, she'd discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary destinies begin with the simple courage to say yes to an uncertain future and the determination to make the best of whatever challenges that future might bring. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us.